All right. So again, my apologies. All right. So what we did last week was we were basically giving the 100-year or so background to what we know as the story of Hanukkah. Meaning we're all on some level familiar with the concept. We say they were Greeks. Maybe we're a little more knowledgeable. We say they're Assyrian Greeks and whatever. But now we're very educated. More educated than most Jews out there in the world because most Jews don't know the history. To understand that the story of Hanukkah came as a result of 100 years of the Hellenism making more and more inroads in the Jewish people. And we said that started with Alexander the Great. And when he conquered the world, he proselytized the Hellenists, the Greek culture, the Greek idols, the Greek theater, the Greek sports. This was all part of his vision of making the world a Hellenist world. And we said only because of the tremendous miracle that happened then with Simon the righteous, Shimon HaTzadik, did he not forcibly bring the Greek culture to the Jews. But at this point, from 100 years ago, the Jews are under the Greek reign. Because we said after Alexander the Great died, which happened quite shortly after, these world conquerors never stay around too long, we said his emperors broke up his empire, and basically the Jews, the land of Judah, the land of the Jews, fell under the Egyptian Ptolemy reign. And for about 100 years, we were under that reign, a little under, less than 100 years. And that was a Greek reign. I mean, it was literally Egyptian, but these were Greek Egyptians, just as we switched to the Assyrians, Greek Assyrians. So at this point, under the Ptolemies, they weren't forcibly, by the sword, having us be Hellenists. But they were enticing us. They were promoting it. And we said, unfortunately, many Jews succumbed and were very intrigued and enamored by this cool, Greek philosophy, Greek sports, Greek worship of the body, Greek theater, and Greek gods. And they took Greek names and they started wearing togas. And we said they moved to Alexandria, which was like a Greek epicenter there, closest one to them. They moved to Greece, so they went to Alexandria and Egypt, which is pretty close. And the Jews, unfortunately, literally the majority of the Jews were falling under the Hellenists. And I said last week that it's almost as if God gave us this tremendous aggressor known as Antiochus, because maybe if he hadn't, again, I'm speculating, but maybe if he hadn't, it just would have been a natural path to the almost entire Hellenization of the Jewish people. And maybe that spark would have been snuffed out, God forbid, but God didn't let that happen. Just sort of like, I'm thinking, like in Europe, especially in Western Europe, there was so much assimilation. And then from the place of assimilation, Germany, came this brutal, genocide of the Jewish people. Like, I'm not letting you be assimilated because if you think you're one of the non-Jews, they don't think so. So it's sort of, I feel like there's sort of a similar parallel energy happening here, parallel movement in history. And we see this many times. And when it looks like we're just going to sort of lose it, melt, fall in the melting pot of the world's history, something happens something vicious happens. Something happens to remind us you're Jewish, you're different, and that wakes us up, and then we return to God. So the person that woke us up, his name was Antiochus. I'm not whitewashing him. He was horrible. He only ruled us with these harsh decrees for 3 years, but those were 3 horrific years for the Jewish people. What happened was Antiochus, who called himself Antiochus Epiphanes, he took upon himself that name. Epiphanes is Greek for the great. So he said, I'm Antiochus the Great. But we said his subjects, instead of saying Epiphanes, said Epinanes, which means the mad one, Antiochus Epimanes, because they said he's crazy. And he probably was crazy. And maybe he was obsessive. I don't know what his issues were. But amid his craziness was this, I have to bring the Greek culture to the entire world. I have to bring the Greek culture to the entire world. So at that point, when he's this madman with lots of power, wanting to bring the Greek culture to the entire world, the Hellenists among the Jews, often, we see this also historically, from our own people comes so much tragedy to us. And we will see this, and we have seen this, and this is a recurring pattern, unfortunately. So the Jews went to him to like, hey, look over there, look at Judah. Well, yeah, you got a lot of non-Hellenists, they better do something. They got people that don't believe in the Greeks, got to get moving. And he was like, oh, wow, okay, let's go for it. And he made a tremendous amount of pressure on the Jews to forcibly bring the remaining ones that weren't Hellenists to be Hellenists. Again, the majority of the Jews at this point were Hellenists. You know, when we say in the prayer on Hanukkah, and we say, you save the few from the hands of the many, the righteous from the hands of the wicked, we're not talking about the Jews versus the Assyrian Greeks. We're talking about the Jews versus the Jews. The few Jews that were still faithful to God versus the majority of the Jews that weren't. The few Jews that were still righteous versus the majority of the Jews that at that point were wicked. Were so far from God, to the degree I'm saying that they were trying to get Antiochus to forcibly bring the other Jews under the Hellenist domain. So what happened that sparked this whole thing? So Antiochus is like, oh, he's going to get these Jews, he's going to get these Jews. And I told you last week, this whole intrigue with the high priest. First there was a righteous one, Chonia, Yochanan, and then his Hellenist brother Jason bribed Antiochus and took over. And then Jason's even more Hellenist friend Menelaus bribed Antiochus with more money and took over. And we said, we don't even know if Menelaus was a Kohen, was a priest. And Menelaus was even more aggressive than Jason in pushing, in his authority as high priest, in pushing the Hellenist program. Antiochus, in the meanwhile, goes off fighting to Egypt. Remember, the Jews have been under the Egyptian Ptolemies, and then in some infighting between these various, we'll call them the descendants of the generals of Alexander, we became under the Seleucidians, which were the Assyrian Greeks. So now the Assyrian Greeks and the Egyptian Greeks are fighting. That happened. And so Antiochus went to Egypt to lead the fight. And a rumor reached Jerusalem that Antiochus was killed. When the Jews in Jerusalem, a rumor, it was not true, heard that Antiochus was killed, Jason, remember Jason was the former high priest that was deposed when Antiochus took an even bigger bribe from his, so to speak, friend Menelaus. Jason came with his army because he felt like free, because Antiochus is gone, so nobody's going to really, you know, till they sort it out. It'll be a while. In the meanwhile, he can take over. Now, again, Jason's a Hellenist. Menelaus is a Hellenist. Menelaus is a bigger Hellenist. They're both Hellenists. But Jason comes with his army, so to speak, with the Jews that were loyal to him, the Hellenists. These are all Hellenists. The religious Jews have no part in any of this. And he comes to attack Jerusalem, to take back his position that Menelaus bribed Antiochus more than he did. Jason got the position by bribing Antiochus. Menelaus got the position from Jason by bribing him with more money. So he comes and he starts conquering Jerusalem and massacring many, many Jews. And he drove Menelaus from his position as high priest, and he became high priest. Now, again, that was not a religious victory. Jason was a Hellenist. Menelaus was a Hellenist. Jason bribed to get the role. Menelaus bribed to get the role. Menelaus was worse, but Jason was no saint for sure. But then, guess what happens? Antiochus not dead. Antiochus is actually very close. Antiochus is in Egypt. Egypt is very close to Israel. Now, we think of it like a 40-year journey, but that's because the Jews took a very roundabout road in the desert. It's very short from Egypt to Israel. So Antiochus is in Egypt fighting and losing. And as he's leaving Egypt, he hears about the revolt against his appointed person. Menelaus was appointed by Antiochus, and so was Jason before, but whatever. Now Jason took the power from Menelaus, and he was like, whoa, what's going on here? I can't beat the Egyptians. Let me at least beat these Jews who have no real army. I mean, they're you know, they haven't had independent power since the time of the first temple, right? A lot of times people misconstrue the story of Chanuka, especially nowadays, and they view it as like the Jews were fighting for nationhood. The Jews were fighting for independence. You know, the Americans had the War of Independence, and the Jews have their War of Independence, Hanukkah. No, Hanukkah was not a war of independence. The Jews were not looking for independence. The Jews had been under the Babylonians, and then they were under the Persians, then they were under the Ptolemies, now they're under the Seleucidians. That's okay, that's not their issue. The issue was that Antiochus was trying to destroy the spirit of the Jews. So Antiochus comes, and he really gets into it. First of all, he got into it because he probably needed some way of feeling he has some power. And he also would look at this affront, we call this chutzpah on Jason's part. And he massacred 40,000 Jews. He massacred 40,000 Jews, obviously deposed Jason, and put Menelaus back in power. And he was on a rampage. So Antiochus personally goes to the temple, despoils it of anything left. I don't know if you remember, we said last week that Menelaus stole many of the precious items of the temple to pay this huge bribe he gave to Antiochus to become the high priest. Whatever was left, Antiochus took. He took the golden candelabra, the menorah, he took the golden table, he took anything he could find, and he made the temple a place of idolatry. He said, this is now the place, this is the central place of idolatry in Judah. He put in Greek gods, and on the 25th of Kislev, to initiate, to inaugurate this new Greek temple, God forbid, he slaughtered a hog on the altar on the 25th of Kislev. We know the 25th of Kislev as the miracle of Chanuka. That happens 3 years later to the day. So this is 3 years before that miracle of Chanuka. At this point, we know we're doing the 25th of Kislev. The 25th of Kislev was marked as a tragic day, as the first day when sacrifices to idols were brought in the temple. So 25th of Kislev till 3 years later, 25th of Kislev. That was the extent of Antiochus's cruel, horrific war, literally against Judaism. It was only 3 years, but it was a horrific, cruel, unbelievable 3 years. And the Jews that stayed loyal, many were massacred, and even the ones that survived went through so much, because it was such a vicious war now. Now again, Antiochus before this whole thing was crazy. Antiochus before this whole thing wanted to bring the Greek culture to everyone. Antiochus before this whole thing already had the Hellenist Jews like having him target Judah. But now he was really mad. He was really on fire. He was really like, this is it. We are destroying any shred of Judaism from these people. Every one of them better be a dyed-in-the-wool Hellenist. Before I'm done, they'll be dead or they'll be a Hellenist. That was basically his campaign. So, and this we view as an exile. So it was an unusual exile because the Jews were in Israel. And the temple still stood. Of course, the temple for the next 3 years is a place of idolatry. The temple still stood. And the Jews were in Israel. This was an exile in Israel. But our sages view it as an exile. The same way we're in Babylonian in exile, these were 3 years of exile. Because we completely were under this harsh regime that every day was trying to kill or Hellenize any Jew left that wasn't already a Hellenist. And we said the majority of the Jews were Hellenists. But there are always those people that cling to God. And those were the ones that are being targeted here. So this is historically the year 3594 to 3597. Those are the 3 years from the 25th of Kislev, 3594, when the hog is slaughtered on the temple. First day an idol is being served, till the 25th of Kislev, 3597, when, of course, the temple is freed by the Hashmonaim after these 3 years. So what did he do? He forbade studying any Torah. If anyone was found possessing any scripture, that was enough to be murdered, obviously, to be executed very cruelly. And they highlighted every commandment they couldn't handle. For example, Shabbos. The Sabbath was forbidden. Why was the Sabbath forbidden? Because the Sabbath is a testimony to God. The Greeks, of course, officially they were idol worshippers, but what they really worshipped was man. The body of man, the mind of man, the art of man, the architecture of man. So the whole concept of the Sabbath, of Shabbos, which we say stop, rest, and acknowledge that God created the world, no way. You can't keep Shabbos. You keep Shabbos, you're dead. The circumcision, bris milah. Circumcision was completely forbidden. If anyone was found circumcising their baby, the parents and the baby were both very cruelly executed. Why? Again, circumcision? What a horrific, horrible thing to do to the human body. The human body is beautiful. Remember, the Greeks worshipped, one of their biggest worships was the human body. They were all into workout. We think we now are into working out. They were so into working out. We're following in their footsteps when we're into it. They're so into working out. They were so into sports. We're into sports. They're so into sports. This is a product of, the Western world is founded on the Greek-Roman culture, which in the Roman culture is founded on the Greek culture. So worshiping the body goes all the way back to the Greeks, and we still have it today. Worshiping sports goes all the way back to the Greeks. The Greeks were the first ones to start worshiping sports. They're the first ones to bring sports into the world, and we still have it today. And their athletes would perform naked, completely naked, no togas, because the human body is so beautiful. An athlete's body, that's such a beautiful thing. So we Jews are going to go and going to cut this piece of this body? And we're saying the body's not complete. It's only complete when we cut off a piece and acknowledge God? Whoa. So no circumcision. And anyone who did so was very cruelly executed. No Rosh Chodesh. What's Rosh Chodesh? Rosh Chodesh is that when the Jews declare the first day of the month. Nowadays we have a calendar. So you can look up ahead or behind and know any date when it falls out. It's a 19-year cycle. It's a very brilliant cycle that our sages did quite a while after the destruction of the Second Temple, because they saw that we would no longer be able to continue the true biblical tradition of sanctifying the moon by eyewitnesses. And when Mashiach comes imminently, we're going to again be sanctifying the moon by eyewitnesses every month. So we won't be able to look ahead and say, oh, what's your son's bar mitzvah parsha? Or what day of the week does your birthday fall out? Or the Hebrew date, what's the English date in a year, in a month? Or that won't exist. But now it does, because we're following a fixed calendar. So the Greeks said no Rosh Chodesh. Why no Rosh Chodesh? Also, because what's Rosh Chodesh saying? Rosh Chodesh is saying that time is sacred. It's not just time, it's sacred. And we mark it as sacred by proclaiming the Rosh Chodesh, which all of the holidays are based on that Rosh Chodesh. The Greeks said, no, time's not sacred. We worship humans. We're officially pagans, but we don't worship God. We worship humans. Nothing's sacred. Jews say, time's sacred. Say, oh, really? You're going to follow Rosh Chodesh? We'll kill you. And again and again and again and again, so many horrific decrees after decrees after decrees to violate the Jews. They violated them spiritually, they violated them physically, they murdered them, they robbed them, they violated them, they abused them, they raped them, they tortured them. For 3 years, they did whatever they could to break and kill any Jew who would not become a Hellenist. And so what happened was that the Jews that were loyal, a lot of them ran away because you couldn't stay in Jerusalem. It was just too dangerous. You're not wearing a toga, forget it. You're not going to survive that day. And I'm saying they were not only murdering the Jews, they were cruelly torturing them. They were doing whatever they could to break the spirit and the bodies and the souls of any Jew that wouldn't succumb to Hellenism. And many Jews died. If you've heard the story of Hannah and her 7 sons, that happened during these 3 years. And many things. There was whatever. There's many such things. A very elderly rabbi, he refused to eat pork. They said, "Fine, we'll give you kosher meat. We'll just pretend it's pork." He said, "No way, no problem. We'll kill you," which they did. So again and again and again and again and again and again, they did so many things to break the Jews, or torture the Jews, or execute the Jews, or a combination of all three. So, what does God have in store? God has in store an elderly priest whose name is Matisyahu. Anyone heard of anybody else named Matisyahu? It ultimately goes back to this priest. Some say he was the high priest at one point. Again, we know at this point the high priest was Menelaus, Jason, Yechoniah. But maybe before he had been a high priest, it's a little obscure historically. Others say maybe his father was a high priest. But he definitely was a descendant of a very, very noble priestly family. And he was loyal to God. And not all the priests were loyal. I mean, again, Chania was loyal. His brother Jason was a Hellenist. So even among the most noble families, people were totally off. But Matisyahu was loyal. And Matisyahu, like many of the Jews that stayed loyal, ran away. There was no way to survive in Jerusalem. So he figured, like many of the Jews at this time did, let me run to some small little town where nobody's going to know me, where the Greeks aren't really around, nobody's paying attention, and we'll live out our life until God will bring us to salvation. He didn't know the Savior was going to be him. You know, also, we see in history sometimes you want to like keep low profile, but God has other plans for you. So low profile, he goes, he has 5 sons, and they go off, they hide, and they come to a small little place called Modi'in. Small little place where he's going to be, you know, and they're living obviously as Jews loyal to God. And, you know, eventually this will pass. Until this passes, we got to survive. We got to keep low profile. We got to stay away from the center where all the Greeks are. When I say Greeks, I mean the Assyrian Greeks. And that lasted for a while until Antiochus said, you know what? There's a lot of Jews in those small little towns outside of Jerusalem. We're focusing on Jerusalem. And you know what? The Jews are running away from Jerusalem. So we're going to go town by town. And in every town, we are going to force the Jews to serve idols. We are going to force the Jews to be Hellenists. No Jew will survive. We don't care if you're in Jerusalem in some little town. And that's what they did. And they came to the little town of Modi'in. And they gathered all the Jews. Now, obviously, Matisyahu is the old leader. You know, he's obviously looks very venerable. He looks very important, very distinguished. So they picked on him. So they said, you, come. You're going to be the first Jew to sacrifice to the Greek idol. He's like, no way, I'm not doing that. And before they even got to like torture him or kill him over it, another Jew said, I'll do it. So another Jew went. He didn't care. He was going to sacrifice to the Greek idol. And when Matisyahu saw that this other Jew was sacrificing to the idol, he took out his sword. And Matisyahu, this old priest, he's not a warrior. He murdered this Jew. He killed this Jew. I'm sorry, this is a critical moment to interrupt our story. Okay. So Matisyahu pulls out his sword, kills the Jew. It was an act of zealotry, of being a zealot for God's name, killed the Jew, and started obviously killing all the Greek soldiers, the Assyrian Greek soldiers. Now, obviously, there weren't so many. I mean, they didn't bring like 1,000 soldiers to take care of this little town. They weren't assuming anyone was going to revolt against them. They assumed all the Jews would listen. I don't know if they had 15 soldiers, 20 soldiers, whatever. But still, here's Matisyahu, this old man, this priest, no warrior. And yet he basically, almost single-handedly, knocked off all those Greeks. And now begins the revolt. How many people were in the initial revolt? I think Rashi says 12. My number's correct. Matisyahu, he had 5 sons, so that's 6 people, and maybe like another, maybe like another 6 or 7 or 8 people. I think Mark said 12, maybe 14, like a very small number of people. That was the original soldiers fighting the entire Assyrian Greek Empire. Does that make any sense? Being Jewish doesn't make that much sense. This is what it is. It's like at this point, Matisyahu wasn't looking to be a warrior. He wasn't looking to be a hero. He was looking to keep low cover and just wait for this to pass. But God didn't give him that choice. God said, center stage, you're leading a rebellion. We know these people were called the Chashmonaim. You've ever heard the term Chashmonaim? They were called the Chashmonaim. It's sort of a debatable historical fact. Why were they called the Chashmonaim? There's lots of different opinions given. Some say maybe it came from the town of Hashmonah, which is where the family originated. Maybe that was it. Chashmonaim is similar to a word in Hebrew which means nobles. So maybe they were called the Chashmonaim because they were this noble family. Maybe it was their surname, Chashmonaim. They also became known as the Maccabees. You ever heard the term Maccabees? Yehuda the Maccabee, Judah the Maccabee. So again, why were they called Maccabees is also a debatable question. We know they're called Chashmonaim. Why is debatable? We know they're called Maccabees. Why is debatable? Some say they were called Maccabee because a Maccabee in Hebrew means a hammer. And they called themselves the Maccabees. They were like God's hammer to onslaught the enemy. Some say they were called Maccabees because their slogan was based on a Hebrew verse, Mi kamocha b'elim Hashem, who is like you among the strong ones, God. And that means Maccabee as well. Some say Maccabee is the word Matisyahu Kohen ben Yochanan, and that's Maccabee. Again, going back to this idea of maybe Matisyahu was really a son of that Yochanan Kohen Gadol. But whatever the case is, we know they were called Chashmonaim, we know they were called Maccabees, and we know they were chosen by God to be the saviors of the Jewish people. And it's interesting how sometimes, and we see this also historically, that sometimes God sort of puts greatness on you. Meaning God puts on you a big challenge, and as you rise to the challenge, it brings to you a certain point of greatness you wouldn't otherwise have, because the challenge itself forces it. I was rereading a little bit over the weekend. It's actually very interesting people coming from Russia. This is the memoirs of a Jew. His name was Lazer Nanas. I actually met him in Israel when he was probably at that time about 99 years old. And he was sentenced to 10 years in the Soviet prison system, the prison camps, Siberian prison camps, for the crime of teaching Torah. And when his 10 years were almost up, they sentenced him again to another 10 years. He spent 20 years in the Siberian prison camps. During his 20 years, yes. Tell her to give it to you. All right, we'll see what will happen. So this Lazer Nanas, yeah, I'm sorry. Yes. I know. I told her. I told her. She's coming. So this Lazer Nanas, thank you, Monsieur. So this Lazer Nanas, he spent 20 years in the Soviet prison camps. For 20 years, he never violated one Sabbath. For 20 years as a prisoner under the Soviets, he never desecrated the Sabbath. For 20 years as a prisoner in the Soviet prison camps, he never ate not kosher. For 20 years as a prisoner in the Soviet camps, he never violated Passover. He never ate leaven on Passover. There was one Passover where he didn't eat anything for 8 days because he had absolutely no food, but he never ate chametz on Passover. For 20 years, he never allowed them to cut off his beard or his side locks or his payas for 20 years. Now, obviously, that makes no sense, and obviously it was a series of miracles. It was also 20 years of such incredible self-sacrifice. You can't imagine it. I highly recommend looking at his memoirs. It's called Sabota. I don't know if they sell it on Amazon, but they sell everything on Amazon, so maybe they do. It's called Sabota, which I think is the Russian or Ukrainian word for Sabbath. And I think the author's pseudonym was called Avraham Netzach. I think that's the author, Avraham Netzach. And the title of the book is definitely called Sabota. And when I've read it before. I read it like 30 years ago, but now my son brought it home. He came home from yeshiva on Thursday, so I like reread bits and pieces of it. And it was just so amazing to me because this person wasn't a tzaddik. He's not a rebbe. You know, today was the day of passing of the rebbe's father, who also suffered amazingly under the Soviets and died in exile. But he was a great, great tzaddik. I'm not knocking his self-sacrifice. He incredibly self-sacrificed as a great tzaddik. But Lezer Nanas was a regular Jew. He wasn't a rabbi. He was a bookkeeper. I mean, a bookkeeper who self-sacrificed and taught Jewish children Torah, and for that crime was 20 years in prison. But he was a regular bookkeeper. And for 20 years, his greatness was unbelievable. Because every single day for 20 years, he self-sacrificed for the Sabbath, for kosher, for Passover, for his beard, for his side locks, to be a Jew. And basically he said, I don't care. You could take my life. Obviously, at any point they could have taken his life, and they tried many, 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 many times. God just didn't let. I mean, you just read his memoirs, and it's full of his self-sacrifice and God's miracles, because he did survive. And he actually lived to quite an old age. I think he passed away, he was 99. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe told him that the 20 years he was in camps, that doesn't come from the calculation of his life, of his lifespan. But he was, for 20 years, day after day after day, they're trying to kill him. They're trying to destroy him. They're trying to take away his Judaism, and he doesn't let. He says, I don't care. Now, technically, did he have to do any of this? No. No, actually, technically, he didn't have to. If you're in such a position, you're allowed to violate the Sabbath. You're allowed to have your beard cut off. You're allowed to eat not kosher. You're allowed to violate Passover. All of those things he was technically allowed to do, but he wouldn't. He said, my relationship to God is more meaningful than any of that. I'm not violating any of that. So he wasn't looking for greatness, but what he achieved was unbelievable. Matisyahu was not looking for greatness. He was not looking to be the savior of the Jewish people. He was looking to really survive this time, this very harsh time. But God put him in this position where it was like, someone's got to stand up for my honor. Someone's got to fight. And Matisyahu and his sons became the fighters. They were priests. They weren't fighters at all. They became the fighters. You know, in modern, you know, how we envision the Maccabees, you know, there's these heroic soldiers. They were priests. They didn't know anything from fighting. But this is what God chose for them, and this is what happened. So again, this revolt was not for national independence. The Jews have not been independent since the first temple. We were under the Babylonians, and we were under the Persians, and we were under the Ptolemies, and then under the Seleucidians. We weren't trying to revolt to create national independence. We had no choice. This was for spiritual survival. So we have Matisyahu and his sons, and started with, I think, about 6 other people, went to the hills, went to the caves in the hills, and from there they started attacking the Greeks. They started a rebellion. They're like, this is it. We're the ones. We have no choice. We're not looking to be heroes, but this is what God's asking us to do, so we're just going to go with trust in God. Now, the truth is, Matisyahu started with 5 sons. By the end of this war, 4 of those 5 sons were dead. Only 1 son survived to ultimately become the leader of the Jews after the whole story of Chanuka. But 4 of his sons perished in these wars, as did many, 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 many Jews. So they start with their, like, as we would call it, guerrilla warfare, just like wherever they could, snipping at the Assyrians, giving them the message, get out of here. We're not scared of you. We're not going to be tormented by you anymore. We're done. We're done. We are not scared, and we are going to drive you out of Israel. And when this happened, the Greeks, the Assyrians were like, whoa, who do you think you're starting up with? I don't know if this is a secular book in English. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It's called The Mouse That Roared. This tiny little country that just declares war on America. So as ridiculous as that scenario is, which of course it's a spoof, we have these tiny little province called Judah, of which we have a tiny minority, because the majority of the people are Hellenists, tiny minority of loyal to God people, and they're starting a guerrilla war against the Assyrian Greek Empire. Like, can you imagine the ludicrous situation? And Antiochus, of course, is enraged. Really? You think you're starting up with me? You think you're fighting back? Like, who do you think you are to fight back? Boy, well, I smashed you now. Till now I was being kind. You should know what I could do. And he sends an army. He sends an entire army to do this. And you know what happened? We won. Didn't make any sense. Was impossible. We can't explain it historically. We can't explain it militarily. But we won. Antiochus said, okay, I guess that was really not a good army. I'm sending another army. And he sent another army. And we won again. Antiochus said, oh, really? Boy, am I going to send a big army. Now, where do we know all this from, by the way? We don't know this from Jewish, is this not recorded in the Talmud? The details of the war are very sketchily recounted in the Talmud. This is actually from secular historical sources of that time, is where we have all of these facts and figures about this crazy war. So now this is the third army Antiochus is sending against us. And Antiochus says, this time I'm going to smash you guys to pieces. So I'm sending a huge army, as if you were huge. You guys are nothing. But for some crazy reason, I'm going to send a huge army against you. And he sent an army of 40,000 infantrymen, and I think it was like 7,000 cavalry. So we have 40,000 foot soldiers, and we have another 7,000 soldiers riding. And he took his best general, Lysias, and they fought. How many Jewish soldiers were there? 3,000. 47,000 Assyrian Greek soldiers to crush 3,000. So it's an interesting figure, because according to the statistics, if you want to win in a battle, I mean, in those days with numbers like that, you generally want it to be like 3 to 1. Like, if I have 3,000, you should have 1,000, and then I'll win you. But if I have 3,000, you have 2,000, I might not win you. If I have 3,000, you have 2,500, I'm probably for sure not going to win you. The Greeks were 47,000. We were 3,000. The odds are 16 against 1. For every 1 soldier we had, they had 16 soldiers. 47,000 to 3,000. And we completely defeated them. Now, how did the Jews prepare for this battle when they're outnumbered 16 to 1? Well, how does a soldier prepare? A soldier should get a good night's sleep. He should eat well. He should sharpen his equipment. He should oil it. He should practice. The soldiers, led by Judah, who was the oldest son, or the main fighting son of Matisyahu, they fasted and they prayed. The preparation of soldiers to fight in a battle with the odds of 16 to 1 is to do only one thing. Nothing else matters. We are completely turning to God. Because the only thing that has kept us till now, they already won 2 battles, which made no sense either. And the only thing that will ever keep us is God. So we're not getting a good night's sleep. We're not eating well. We're not practicing with our weapons. We're not oiling our equipment. We're not reviewing strategies. We are fasting and praying. And that's how Judah and his soldiers prepared for this war. Now, what happened technically was that the Greeks said, I don't even know why they bothered. Because they knew they were outnumbering 47,000 to 3,000, but still they were scared. Because for some crazy reason, which made no sense to anyone, but both sides knew it, for some crazy reason, the Jews already won 2 battles. This is the third army Antiochus is sending. The first 2 were routed. Obviously, the first 2 armies weren't 47,000, but they were still vastly outnumbering the Jews, both in numbers and, of course, in equipment. I mean, what supplies did the Jews have anyway? So what the Greeks did, because they were a little nervous, even though there were 47,000 of them, is they split the camp. One part of the army stayed in home base, and the other part decided we're making a surprise raid on the Jewish army. So instead of having to actually go to battle with them, we're going to get them at night. So we're not going to take our whole army, and we're going to take 47,000 soldiers, but we're going to keep like part at the base, and another part is going to come at night while the Jews are sleeping, and we'll knock them off then, because if they have some weird mystical powers, we don't want to really have to deal with it. Let's just do that. What happened was Judah divined that this is what the Greeks were going to do. So as the Greek army is coming to attack the sleeping Jews who were not sleeping left their base and attacked the sleeping Greeks that were sleeping, the ones that stayed behind, the ones that were not part of the surprise raid on the Jews. Again, it still makes no sense. I mean, it was still 3 to 47,000, but that's actually what happened. And so what they did was, so this 3,000 captured the base, the supply base, where the Greek army that was left was there, and they completely routed them. Again, it makes no sense, but they did. And they took all their supplies. So now they have lots and lots and lots of weapons, because they had no weapons. They had almost no weapons, but now they got the whole base with the food stores and the weapons of this 47,000 Greek army. And when the Greek army, this 47,000 men army, realized this, they were so, discombobulated, they just ran. Now, so at this point, so this 47,000 army basically ran back home to Assyria, whoever made it, in complete disgrace. I told you this was Antiochus's best general. His name was Lysias. So Lysias said, he was obviously, he wasn't a believer. He was a believer in Lysias, and he wasn't a believer in God. And he was like, I guess I didn't have enough troops. I don't know what exactly happened there, but whatever. I'm coming back. Don't worry, Jews. I'm coming back. And I'm coming back with more troops. Lysias came back a year later. This time he had 60,000 foot soldiers. He had 5,000 cavalry. We had 65,000 soldiers. By this point, the Jews' army has gotten bigger. Now, why is the Jews' army getting bigger? Well, what's happening on the side of the Jews is that with each crazy supernatural victory Judah has, more and more Jews start coming home. Meaning, remember, I said that initially it was a tiny minority of the Jews that were in Hellenists. I don't know, tiny minority. It was a minority of the Jews that were in Hellenists. The majority of the Jews were Hellenists. The majority of the Jews weren't supporting this at all. The minority of the Jews were being persecuted, and the majority of the Jews, unfortunately, many of them were saying, rah, 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 let's get rid of those old-fashioned, whatever. I mean, I don't know if they really appreciated the torture and the executions, but a lot of them wanted everyone to become Hellenists or just to disappear. Now, Yehuda already had 3 amazing victories. He had 1 victory. He had a 2nd victory. He had a victory over an army of 47,000, which in those days was like, a huge, unbelievable army. So this empowered and inspired the Jews that were loyal and a number of the Jews that were not loyal. Meaning both the Jews that were loyal, but they weren't going to go fight. I mean, they were going to stay hiding in the caves and just pray for this to be over. Well, they started getting courage and they wanted to join this army. But also among the Hellenists, they started thinking about God. They were Jews. A Jew always believes. Even if a Jew is doing completely wrong, they always believe. So these Jews that were Hellenists started rethinking, what's going on here? How did this 3,000 men army defeat a 47,000 man army? That makes no sense, except that there's a God. Well, if there's a God, what am I doing with my life? So Jews started leaving the ways of Hellenists and returning to God. And some of them even joined his army. So a year before, when Lysias is attacking, and again, we know all these figures from secular sources, Judah had 3,000 people. A year later, He has 10,000 people. Now, he's 10,000 against 65,000, but that's not our issue. That's God's issue. But I'm just saying from the Jews' end, his army grew by 7,000 people, which means 7,000 Jews started believing, either believing Jews that got more courage, or Jews that were Hellenists and said, what am I doing with my life? I see the hand of God. What am I doing? Sort of interesting, because it says that, it's an interesting midrash about Mashiach, about what happened in Egypt, which relates to Mashiach. It says that when the Jews left Egypt, there's a term that's used, that chamushim. They went out chamushim. The root word chamushim is chamish, which means 5. The midrash says that why does it say chamushim, chamish? Because only 1 in 5 Jews got out of Egypt. 4 Jews perished. Because in the plague, the second to last plague, the last plague was the striking of the firstborn, and then the Jews left. But in the, oh no. Okay, I've got to make this short because I see my battery's about to die. I'll try to just wrap up this point. In the second to last plague of darkness, any Jew that didn't believe died. So the midrash says that 4 to 5 died, only 1 out of 5 left. And then there's a harsher version of this midrash that says not 1 out of 5, 1 out of 50. 49 Jews died and 1 survived and left Egypt. And there's a harsher midrash that says no, not 1 out of 50, 1 out of 500. 499 Jews didn't believe, and only 1 believed and got out. And then there's another version of the midrash that says no, chamushim doesn't mean anything like that. It means armed. The Jews left armed. So here we have a very depressing midrash. Either 4 out of 5 died, or 49 out of 50 died, or 499 out of 500 died. So the Lubavitcher Rebbe says, what's going on here? What was this horrible midrash about how many Jews died in Egypt that were non-believers, and therefore God were not able to come out? And he says, this is supposed to tell us what's going to happen by Mashiach. And when we have right before the advent of Mashiach, we're going to have a lot of Jews that aren't going to believe. And if you're a believer, it's going to start off like you're 1 in 500. And for every 1 believer, there'll be 499 people that don't believe. But take heart, keep believing. The numbers will turn. And you'll see, instead of being 1 out of 499, 1 out of 500 that believe, the numbers will shift. It'll be 1 out of 50. You still are very outnumbered. For every 1 believer, there's 49 non-believers, but the numbers are getting a lot better. But take heart, numbers will get better than that. It'll be 1 out of 5. Still outnumbered. For every believer, there's 4 non-believers, but it's only 1 out of 5, not 1 out of 50, not 1 out of 500. And keep believing, keep going with God, and the numbers will shift even more, and every Jew will be a believer. And then we come to that final explanation of the midrash that it doesn't mean 1 out of 5 or 1 out of 50, 1 out of 500. It means armed, because every Jew will leave this exile. So you see here this process of Mashiach, as the Rebbe is explaining this midrash, that we start out with a tremendous, vast majority of Jews that don't believe. But then as the believers keep believing, the numbers shift and more people believe. But there's still a lot of non-believers. But as those believers believe, the numbers shift and there's more believers. And then as those believers believe, the numbers shift and there's more believers and there's more believers and there's more believers until everyone's a believer. As every Jew sincerely will get out of this exile. And I'm just bringing this in here as a point of reference, thinking of the story of what happened here when Yehuda's army went from about 6 or 12 or 14, whatever the original number was, it became eventually 3,000. A year later, it was 10,000. Because as the believers believed, and as the believers self-sacrificed, and as the believers experienced incredible miracles, a lot of other Jews said, what am I doing? What am I doing? I also want to be with God. And that's how his army moved from 3,000 to 10,000 in that year. Okay, we will stop now, especially because I think my computer's about to die. So I'll stop before it does. But we are in the middle of the story, and to be continued next week, and that we all have such a knowledgeable, historical, rooted understanding of course, that holiday we all know called Chanuka, but what really happened and why. Have a wonderful week.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you. Thank you, Phil. You too.